Hi, Jacob.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Excellent.
Excellent. That's better than I'm accustomed to personally, but I'm not going to complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. No extra charge. You are Jacob Heilbrunn, editor of the National Interest, one of America's leading foreign policy magazines. Is that fair to say?
I hope it is.
Okay. How long has the National Interest been around?
Almost 31 years.
So we can't quite say one of America's most august.
We try to be more of a guerrilla operation than a...
Okay, you're part of the insurgency. You're part of the foreign policy. You are fighting the blob 24/7.
Correct. The
blob, as people may or may not know, is the term that apparently Ben Rhodes and Barack Obama used to refer to the D.C. foreign policy establishment.
That's right.
And you are opposed to the blob, and you will stop at nothing to kill it.
We keep a close eye on the deep state as well.
It's a job somebody's got to do. Well, good. Well, we can talk about all that. Oh, plenty to talk about. Plenty to talk. And maybe in the course of that, it'll become clear in what sense you are part of an insurgency, or in what sense your view is kind of an alternative to a couple of dominant schools, which I would call neoconservatism and liberal interventionism. Speaking of which, you wrote a book called They Knew They Were Right, The Rise of the Neocons. Right,
and had nothing to do with medicine.
Nothing to do with medicine. The colon, actually, you're not supposed to read out loud. You make a good point. So let's try that again. The title is They Knew They Were Right. The subtitle is The Rise of the Neocons.
Absolutely.
I know nothing of any colon. So, wow. So, we're taping this mere hours after a summit between President Trump and Vladimir Putin and a press conference thereafter, and only days after an interesting series of escapades for Trump in Europe, including a NATO summit and an encounter with Theresa May that was not entirely to her liking, the Prime Minister of England, Great Britain. So where should we start? I guess with the Putin thing. Now, I did not watch the press conference. I was otherwise engaged. I tried to catch up and quickly, afterwards gauge the level of outrage with Trump's performance. It was pretty high. In fact, I switched back and forth between like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox. Even on Fox, he wasn't getting great reviews.
I would say the level of wrath was Vesuvian.
Vesuvian?
Yes.
You're a classically educated person. That's one reason you're here.
It was interesting. On Fox, one of their hosts called Trump's performance disgusting. John McCain said that Trump has more abjectly abased himself before a dictator.
Of course, McCain's wrath is not a huge surprise here.
No, but it is interesting to me that Liz Cheney, also who's serving in the House, sent out a statement attacking Trump, because the Cheneys have been fairly friendly to Trump. And you have a lot of our Democratic friends as well interpreting or construing Trump's performance as vindication. For example, John Chait says that Trump's performance in Helsinki was even beyond what he could have imagined, and affirms his contention that Trump himself is an agent of the Kremlin.
Yeah, of course, there too, not as big a surprise as it would be coming from, say, Glenn Greenwald, right? I mean, John Chait has been, he had written a piece that I thought was not entirely persuasive previous to that about how maybe Trump had really been, essentially under the control of the Kremlin for years.
Since 1987.
Yeah, that seemed, I was not persuaded by the evidence that was a highly likely thing. And to be fair, John didn't claim that was highly likely. He said it was worth considering.
Well, he presented it in the form of a stock, I think, that Trump was like a penny stock. So the Kremlin picked it up, made the initial negligible investment, and then watched it flourish and prosper over the years.
Right. So what is the main source of outrage? What are people mainly citing? Was it the point where he kind of not only refused to confirm the American intelligence establishment's view that Russia interfered in the election, but seemed to almost take Putin's word for the fact that Russia didn't?
Well, there does seem to be a sort of mental synergy between the two. It was sometimes hard to tell where Trump ended and Putin began, because there was kind of a mind meld there. And Trump was grinning, and Trump's contention was that he was unsure if Russia had hacked into the election, and it didn't make sense to him why they would have in any case. And he suggested that Putin's word might be even more reliable than his own director of national intelligence, Dan Coates.
Yeah.
So predictably, this has triggered a furor in at least Washington, D.C. How it's being received in the rest of the country is another question.
I mean, the part of Fox the segment of Fox I watched did I thought they did, not that they were necessarily planning this, but I mean, I thought it amounted to doing a pretty good job of being as critical as you kind of have to be to maintain your credibility without sending signals that would convince a whole lot of Trump supporters to abandon ship. I don't know. I doubt it was coordinated. I mean, it actually seemed like different people expressing reasonably genuine opinions, but I kind of wonder if it'll actually move the needle.
It's always hard to know, because Trump does have these amazing survival skills, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm. Also, by the time we post this, he'll probably have taken 70% of it back or something. I mean, he did a 180 with Theresa May.
That's what I was thinking. Since whatever he can retroactively redefine his remarks, he'll just say that it was fake news that he didn't criticize Putin. It was obvious that he had made censorious remarks during their press conference.
Right.
So to pin down Trump is obviously very tricky, and the senators are being cautious about attacking him as well. I mean, the Republican Party does cower before Trump. They behave to Trump the way that his critics allege that Trump behaves to Putin.
Yeah, Lindsey Graham was pretty critical. That's not as predictable as John McCain, quite, I think.
Yeah, though Lindsey Graham has always been a Russia hawk.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of which, I mean, on Fox, they had this member of the Wall Street Journal editorial board, Mary something.
Kissel?
What's that?
Kissel, yeah.
Yes. She lit into Trump. And that just shows you that the Wall Street Journal's editorial opinion page is almost endlessly willing to accommodate Trump, maybe, but they really draw the line at foreign policy, right?
It is interesting. There are these certain red lines that exist in the conservative media. And it's always interesting, especially the Wall Street Journal editorial page. For them, it seems to be free trade and Russia seem to be the two things.
Well, don't you think also Syria is an issue? There's a fear among kind of Russia hawks of a neoconservative persuasion that Trump will turn over Syria to the Russians, pull the American troops out. There were intimations that they had certainly discussed Syria, Trump and Putin, and there's a big concern that the American troops will vacate and leave Israel vulnerable. Clearly, Trump is trying to get a deal where Russia guarantees that they will keep Iran at bay in some sense, and in Syria, and Israel won't have to worry about them. But I don't think that assurance is enough for the Wall Street Journal's editorial page.
No, and it's probably not enough for Netanyahu either. The Israelis now are continuing to bomb the Iranians. They're at minimum trying to keep them 50 miles away from the Golan Heights.
Well, don't they? I mean, I don't want to get too far away from the Trump news, but don't they have the capacity to do that? Nobody's complaining. Nobody in the world, I mean, it's on the face of it, it's a clear violation of international law. As a rule, Iran's not attacking them. They're just attacking Iran. Iran is in Syria with the permission of the Syrian government. Pretty clear violation of international law. nobody ever says anything, not even Iran, basically, because I guess it's too embarrassing to admit that you got bombed and didn't retaliate. So, like, why is Israel worried about being able to keep Iranian troops 50 miles away or whatever?
Well, I mean, it's obvious they don't want the Iranians establishing bases and then lobbing missiles into Israel from Syria.
No, but I mean, it seems to me they have the military power to send the message that it's really not wise for the Iranians to camp close to Israel.
Right, and I think that's what they keep doing with the connivance of the Russians.
Well, yeah, Russia's tolerating it.
Yes,
and that's, but anyway, that's not enough reassurance for some. So is that the main issue that people are focused on? I mean, not Syria, but the issue of Trump seeming to believe Putin over his intelligence services and now over Mueller on the question of Russian involvement in the U.S. election?
Absolutely. He's being called, John Brennan, the former CIA director, said that called Trump's behavior treasonous.
Now that is going, well, he also said high crimes and misdemeanors. In other words, an impeachable offense. I think that's a little bit overboard, right?
Yeah. I mean, you know, the interesting thing about Trump, if we want to study the psychology of Trump, is to what extent is he simply trolling his critics and detractors? When he gets up there and blows off steam and goes on the attack, right? The Trump methodology is always to take when he's being attacked is to reverse it, right? And that's in a sense what he did today. He went back onto the witch hunt, that he was completely innocent, being vilified and so forth. But he does have an amazing ability to rile up his adversaries.
Yeah. Now, I mean, speaking of the psychology of Trump, and this is another point, you know, there is value in switching back and forth and watching some Fox.
I couldn't agree more.
They reminded us that when Trump, you know, I mean, if you look at MSNBC, especially, and CNN, you would have thought, I mean, once you, of course, you had to wade through just minutes and minutes of sheer expression of outrage before you got to substance. But to the extent that there was analytical substance, it was like he's obviously in bed with the Russians or under control of the Russians, blah, blah, blah. And one point that was made on Fox is there is another explanation, which is that leaving the question of collusion aside, obviously he's not going to admit to collusion, but even if you take that off the table, he doesn't want to admit that anyone gave Hillary Clinton any illicit help in beating him. You know, and Trump, most of us would rather not admit that we might not have won something fair and square, but Trump especially is going to have natural resistance to that. So I don't think we can rule that out as a big factor in why he's so reluctant to accept the conventional explanation about Russian intervention in the election. Definitely.
I mean, the guy is all about pride and dominance, manhood, swagger. But the weird thing I would say about the press conference today was how deferential he was to Putin. I mean, Isaac Chotiner had a good piece in Slate pointing out that Trump, when he's with almost any other world leader, tends to be pretty combative. And with Putin, he was like watching a personality transplant take place. I mean, he really defers to the guy.
Yeah, I didn't watch the conference, so I didn't. Of course, you know, it's funny. I mean, he has a tendency to make nice when he's in the presence of people in a way that he may or may not otherwise. Now, with Putin, you could say he's always making nice, fine. But with Theresa May, he did something he's really done repeatedly, which is, well, I mean, he doesn't always do this, but he has been known to criticize people fiercely and then in their presence to make nice. He did that with Theresa May. He did a kind of a turnabout during the NATO summit. Same thing, going in with guns a-blazing. Although in the case of the NATO summit, he declared victory in the end. With Theresa May, it was really more like making up to her.
Right, which raises, there's another theory about Trump, the Trump the wimp theory, that for all the bluster, he really doesn't have the cojones to face down world leaders one-to-one, so that when he is next to them, he does back down.
Yeah, although at the NATO summit, he was talking tough in the presence of these people for a while. He was saying, I mean, let's quickly review the weird...
Publicly, but not privately.
What's that?
Publicly, but not privately, and as I believe he was more deferential.
Oh, privately he was more deferential?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's another theory about his NATO thing. So let's review. So first, the whole thing starts out with NATO. He goes to NATO. He's obviously been known to complain that our NATO partners aren't doing their fair share. He clearly doesn't have any kind of grasp on the details. Like he at one point seemed to say that they're supposed to be paying 2% of their GDP on military stuff. Actually, they agreed to do that by some year in the future. So he was wrong about that. And then he says, and then he demands that they make it 4%. We don't even spend 4% of our GDP on military stuff. That's like a crazy number. And so he's like, and then he says this thing in the presence of, at the table with other leaders. I guess Angela Merkel was there when he said that Germany is controlled by Russia.
Right.
And he said Germany gets 70% of its energy for Russia. That's wrong. They get 67% of their natural gas, which is just a subset of their total energy from Russia. So he had that whole escapade. And then the next day he declares victory and says, yeah, I made real progress. They've really agreed to do things they weren't agreeing to before. It's not, there's no evidence that that's true. But what's your take? What's your analysis on what happened? What's your favorite explanation for the Trump we saw in the NATO summit?
I think he partly got ginned up by John Bolton.
Huh.
And Bolton told him, and the ambassador, Rick Grinnell in Berlin, ginned him up. Because I don't believe, if you notice when Trump recited that spiel about the initial spiel at breakfast, about the Allies not doing enough, and he denounced Gerhard Schroeder. He didn't know who Gerhard Schroeder was. My sources tell me that Bolton and the ambassador prepped Trump. And I also think I think he's still talking to Steve Bannon. Well,
I think that may help explain the British episode, the interview he gave the Sun with Theresa May. But and we'll talk about that. But on it, as far as NATO goes, I didn't realize, of course, John Bolton's his national security advisor, a fairly recent arrival, and Bolton terrifies almost everyone who knows anything about foreign policy.
Well, he's the antithesis of your views because you're a collective security guy, right?
Well, I am a collective security guy. I am not as worked up as some people are about Trump and NATO because it isn't clear to me how vital NATO is to anyone's security. And in fact, I think there is something to be said for the case that the undiscerning expansion of NATO helped turn relations with Russia south.
I thought
it apparently gave the Soviet, or what was it, Soviet Union? No, it's Russia, I guess. But anyway. Yeah, it was Russia. We gave them apparently an oral agreement some years ago. I don't know, maybe it was the first President Bush or Clinton or somebody, that we would not expand NATO to the borders, but we did.
I thought I intuited a latent sympathy on your part for Donald Trump's foreign policy, and now it's coming out.
Oh, well, there are things about it I like. I mean, on balance, I think, we need to get him off the stage ASAP. He's just a dangerous guy.
Mm-hmm.
But if he had stuck with what he said in the campaign on foreign policy, I'd be closer to liking his foreign policy. But as you know, for most purposes, he was swallowed by the neocon establishment that runs Republican foreign policy. So there goes that. I mean,
but you have this peculiar. That's why you have these peculiar episodes, like in Helsinki, where his entire where he goes in one-on-one with Trump, with Putin, because he doesn't want his staff there interfering with him and preventing him from playing kissy face with Putin.
Right.
So yes, you're right. The administration is filled with hawks. Pompeo too. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, is another ardent hawk. So it is peculiar, isn't it?
Well, it is. I want to say even his campaign foreign policy was only about 50% to my liking. I liked the non-intervention part, and saying we've gotten ourselves into trouble with mindless military intervention. But Trump is never been an international law guy or a global governance guy, and those things are very important to me.
No, everything from this, if you reject the theory of Trump as the cat's paw of Putin, and you're willing to acknowledge that or believe that Trump is his own independent actor, then he's trying to take us back to the world of the 1920s and 30s, isn't he? A great power world where there are no institutions that inhibit American power. You know, I'm reminded Irving Kristol was opposed to American membership in NATO from the 1950s onward.
Was he?
One of the leading neocons.
And of course, the father, Bill Kristol, who is a current leading neocon.
Right, but Irving Kristol was much more of an isolationist. But he also thought that being a member of NATO inhibited the exercise of American power, that we needed to be more unilateralist, more like John Bolton, that we don't really need allies. We can do it on our own because we're so powerful. And that kind of seems to be where Trump is too, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think some people call it a kind of Jacksonian, not in the sense of Scoop Jackson, who is more of a neocon, but in the sense of Andrew, I guess, an America that doesn't especially like foreign intervention, but if you mess with us, we'll completely kill you. I don't know if that's true of Andrew Jackson, but I've heard that said. But anyway, I think that it's a very unilateralist. It's not interventionist, but it's far from pacifist, precisely because it is belligerent. It is unilateralist and belligerent.
And that's why when he was in Britain, he told the truth to the Sun, right? Which was that he didn't want to deal with the UK if it was a member of the European Union. He wants to deal with these countries on a one-on-one basis.
Right. Exactly. I mean, he just does not like international acronyms of any kind. And I can't think of one that he likes. And, he headed there. That was after NATO. And again, with NATO, he screamed and, throws his fit. And then he says, okay, well, they finally came around to my view, which there's no evidence that's true. No evidence that he agreed to anything. So he goes to Britain. And then the evening, I guess, before he's going to meet with Theresa May, he gives this interview to The Sun, a Rupert Murdoch publication. And he basically says, and of course the backdrop for this is that Theresa May is in a tight spot. She didn't favor Brexit, but she now has to execute it as prime minister. What support there was for it came from within her party. And she's offered a tentative deal to the EU about how exactly they implement Brexit. It involves a certain amount of ongoing integration with the EU because she would like to maintain what trade benefits there are from membership in the EU and abandon the things that some Brits found most noxious, like open borders on immigration. So that's and then Boris Johnson, her rival, who would like to be prime minister, is inter-party, resigns, and so does some other guy. Johnson says, this isn't tough enough Brexit. We want out of the EU. That should at least be our opening bid. Trump comes in this interview, supports Johnson, says he'd make a great prime minister. I mean, we really should pause to reflect on what a bizarre departure this is from all known norms of
regime
diplomacy.
Change.
What's that?
He wants regime change.
He does. It's regime change in Britain. But on the eve of a summit with a prime minister to basically, and he said, I told her about how to handle Brexit. She's not doing it right. Boris Johnson would make a great prime minister. I mean, that is mind blowing. And what is your theory? I think one thing going on there is Bannon had his ear. What do you think?
Absolutely. And there's rumors that Farage was on the outer circles as well. Nigel Farage, the former head of UKIP.
Who Trump has a long-standing relationship with. He's like Mr. Brexit.
Now, these are the guys that he feels emotionally comfortable with. I mean, I think Trump is kind of an alt-right guy. And, that nativism and populism. And, of course, Brexit was prophesied his own victory in a way. I mean, it was such a that was a black swan event.
Complete with the polls getting it wrong.
Yeah. And it was a sign, too, that even though the word is overused, elites did have, were completely, I was going to say have their heads up their asses, but I don't know if we're allowed to talk like that on this show.
Apparently you are.
Well, it's Trump. It's the Trump era. Why not? I think that that really was a sign that the Trump thing. It's not purely concocted. There is obviously some depth of animus towards elites. Yeah.
No, I think. I guess that's true. I think he does identify with. I think you're right. He is a nativist, not quite an isolationist, precisely because of the unilateral belligerence I referred to. But he has a lot of that in him, which, by the way, makes it interesting that for reasons we kind of alluded to before, a number of people you would expect to love him, Buchananites, are not happy with his foreign policy because of the symbiosis with the neocon establishment.
Well, it is very interesting. I mean, Trump's foreign policy, a lot of people today are talking about that he sounded like Howard Zinn or Noam Chomsky. There is...
Wait, in what part of it? What part of what he said?
Well, he said we're to blame as well.
Right. He said that today in the press conference, right, that we are partly to blame for the downward spiral of relations with Russia going back to the Obama administration.
But also, I think even for the election hacking, I think he was suggesting. That was my sense. I have to look at it more closely. But what it is remember, the old bugaboo for neoconservatives was moral equivalence. They constantly bashed liberals in the 1970s and 80s for equating the Soviet Union and the United States.
Right.
And Ronald Reagan and Gene Kirkpatrick and others constantly said that this was a sign of moral relativism and rot in the liberal ethos.
Right.
So now you have, of all people, we're seeing a total role reversal, Bob. The liberals, who are traditionally pro-détente, are becoming cold warriors, and the Republican Party under Trump's aegis is now all détente.
And this is what drives people like Glenn Greenwald crazy. Is the left pivot on what their foreign policy is, and I think it's an interesting statement about the psychology of tribalism, which is that it's organized around your feelings toward individual people. If you decide you hate Trump, then whatever foreign policy he favors, you're against. He likes Russia, you hate Russia. I mean,
exactly. I thought it was interesting. Not to refer to him ad nauseum, but John Chait had a good line, I think, the other day where he said, I think it was John who said that Trump is when he was in Montana, is training his base to hate NATO and love Putin, just by the sheer repetition. And you're absolutely right. Specific policy stands are not that important as long as they don't directly impact people's lives. Now, the tariffs, something like that, where it actually hits you, may be a different matter.
Right.
But overall, our politics seems to be completely tribal.
Well, nobody's famous. Foreign policy is something that famously most people have never cared about unless a bunch of Americans are coming home in body bags. And that's why it's always been disproportionately influenced by relatively small interest groups. It's like, but
Trump,
I wouldn't say that it's only repetition that Trump is using. There's to get his base to warm up to his views on like Russia. There's also the fact that the more the resistance screams about Russia, the more his base is going to conclude that Russia can't be all that bad if they're the enemies of our enemies.
Well, and there's more to it than that. Remember, Putin is an authoritarian leader who claims to be defending the Christian West against the Muslim hordes. And that, I think, resonates. I mean, even during the election, people like Rudy Giuliani were extolling Vladimir Putin. Patrick Buchanan was writing laudatory op-eds about the greatness of Putin. I think there's an instinctual reverence for an authoritarian leader among certain sectors of the American right. And Putin certainly tapped into that. And it's probably not that different from, say, Pat Buchanan's father was an admirer of Francisco Franco, the Spanish dictator.
Mm-hmm.
So the right has always had its own set of dictators that it's admired.
Yeah, no, the network that is in a way taking shape internationally that Trump is part of in Eastern Europe, in Russia, maybe in India, is ethno-nationalist, right? I mean, leaders coming to the fore who are staunch nationalists, they appeal to, in one sense or another, the ethnic heritage of the nation as they knew it in some point in the past. In India, Hinduism is important. In Europe, Christianity is often important, and/or the Caucasian ethnicity. And it's assuming a kind of global coherence. I mean, not worldwide.
Yeah, it does. It does seem to be united by a common set of grievances, though there is something paradoxical about it, though. Of course, since nationalism is based on fear of the other, it is a little odd that you would have a right-wing international as opposed to a communist international. In theory, they shouldn't be able to get along.
You mean the irony of it being an international alliance of anti-internationalists?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I'm actually writing a piece for Wired where I'm emphasizing that. It may not show up for a while because it may be in the actual physical magazine. But it is an irony. I mean, I have a whole spiel about how, well, I won't get into my spiel, but yeah, no, it is an international alliance of anti-internationalists. In terms of what unites them, I mean, there is a strong strength. I mean, first of all, as it happens, I mean, I would divide the kind of generic sources from the kind of particularistic. I mean, generically, there's a lot of backlash against globalization and the elites perceived as being globalists, right? But the more contingent fact that it's also a reaction against is Islamist extremism, or whatever you want to call it, in many cases. I mean, in India, that's long-standing tension with Muslims. In Russia, it starts with what really has nothing to do with Islam. I mean, Chechnya was a nationalist reaction, but Putin would love to paint it, as part of the global. He would love to just join the global war on terror and get us to legitimize anything he does in Chechnya or elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
But, one thing that occurs to me, just while we're sort of jumping around here a little bit, that, you wrote a cover story for the New Republic years ago calling for collective security. How do you feel now? We seem to be moving away further than ever from that vision, or not.
I'm trying to remember which piece you mean. You mean collective security? Well, it's probably a pro-UN. It was about collective security at the global level.
Yes.
Yeah. In other words, the original idea behind the United Nations.
Right. You may have completely forgotten the piece. That always happens to all.
No, I mean, I'm not sure I can. Well, I did. There was a cover that said "One World Max," or I don't know. Anyway, who knows? But it's funny. That's how the Wired piece started. It was more like about the question they asked.
That may have been when you were the editor and could just put yourself on the cover at will.
No, I didn't have time. When I was acting editor for 7 months, and I did not have time to put myself anywhere. I was sometimes I was writing a column, but I didn't put myself on the cover. But that's kind of the question that started this Wired piece. It was more like, well, it was more about my book Nonzero, but isn't the world doing the opposite of fulfilling your
right.
And so that's what the piece is about. Well, yeah, I think, this was never a prediction of mine, not a strong prediction. It was a hope and a warning that if we didn't go in this direction with more globalized collective security and respect for international law, we'd be in trouble. My line partly is that a lot of the blame for this kind of thing does lie back in the past with people like Obama and Clinton. There's been zero respect for international law.
Doesn't it really go back to the Iraq War? Isn't that the proximate cause of a lot of this?
I think so, and that by almost any reading is a violation of international law. The Security Council did not authorize the war.
Even if you look at the first Iraq War, Sam Tannenhouse had an interesting piece in New York Magazine.
This is the Bush won.
Yeah, even that war was sold on pretty flimsy they were lying about stuff.
Well, they were, but there are two differences. I mean, first of all, Iraq clearly had done something that under the UN Charter warrants.
Yes.
They had invaded a country, right. A, and B, we got the Security Council's approval. That was a legal war. George Bush's father fought a legal war in Iraq. George W. Bush fought an illegal war in Iraq. That's true.
And I think a lot of this, at least in the United States, probably in Britain too, is the sense that we were lied to during the Iraq War. It was sold under false pretenses. It turned into a disaster. It seemed to epitomize elite bungling. I mean, Trump tapped into all of that beautifully, I thought, during the primaries.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we paved the way for him in a lot of ways. Plus, the Iraq War set in motion. Without the Iraq War, it's hard to imagine ISIS existing. It's certainly, if you take away both the Iraq War, and even if you grant the Iraq War, but take away the decision by us and our allies to fill Syria with weapons that turned what probably would have been a doomed insurrection into a full-scale civil war, if you just take that away, there might not be ISIS as we know it. But in any event, all of this turbulence led to a level of fear about Muslims in America that if you take that away, Trump might not be president.
That's certainly true. How do you feel about all these never-Trumpers who were involved in conceptualizing the Iraq War? Do you think they have some culpability actually for Trump that they're not willing to address?
At what point in this conversation did you start interviewing me?
I don't know. That's the old journalistic trick. Come on.
But what's so you mean that the neocon never-Trumpers?
Yeah.
So what's the question?
I'm wondering what you think the extent of their culpability is for the rise of Trump, because many of them were involved with the George W. Bush administration and in selling.
I think anybody who played a role in the Iraq War happening has a lot of explaining to do about Donald Trump being president. Absolutely. I think you take the Iraq War. The thing about Trump is there's so many little things. I mean, it was a close election. If you take him away, he's probably not president. You take away the email hacks, he's probably not president. On the other hand, if Hillary doesn't use the word deplorables, he might not be president. Mistakes were made all over. But certainly, the Iraq War, I wrote a piece, this is an answer to your question for Vox about Bill Kristol, kind of suggesting, did I quite suggest it, that this is to some extent, beware of Bill Kristol is what I said, is like he's using the Trump moment to ally himself with the resistance. And I said, just be careful. Believe me, the next ill-advised war that is on the table, he's going to support, and he's going to have a lot more liberal supporters now than he did going into this Trump thing.
Well, since I'm not supposed to be asking you too many questions, I'll talk a little about, you were asking earlier what the national interest actually stands for.
Right. Let's get into that.
Magazine. And the premise is that, the national interest purports or it seeks to represent realism in American foreign policy. So many of the authors, tend to be less ideological. And if you look at someone like Steve Walt or John Mearsheimer, both of whom are very down on Trump, but they do think, for example, that you need to have better relations with Russia. Mm-hmm. The interesting, and some of our contributors are more critical, some are more receptive to working with Russia. They would argue, they think in balance of power terms. You have a rising China. How are you going to counter that? You have limited resources. You don't want to engage in humanitarian crusades abroad, expending your resources. So the interesting question about Trump, I guess, for a realist would be, is Trump, in fact, sabotaging realism by tarnishing it? That'll be the interesting question.
Yeah, now we should probably ask you to define realism. Some people may think it's a term using casually to mean kind of pragmatist, but in foreign policy circles, it has a kind of formal meaning. What do you mean by it?
Well, there is a certain verbal sleight of hand to the word, which I will confess up front. And I don't know that I can call myself a staunch realist. Having been more sympathetic to the neocons, I've sort of given up on ideological maxims. But a realist would define themselves as someone who believes that the United States should focus on its national interests more narrowly and not engage in liberal internationalism, i.e., a crusading foreign policy on behalf of human rights. Many of the realists are opposed to intervention in Syria. They believe in something, a lot of them believe in something called offshore balancing, which means that you rely on the Navy to project American power. Mm-hmm. They don't necessarily have bases they don't want an empire. Mm-hmm. They don't want bases all around the world. They believe that America is overstretched and that by trying to accomplish everything, it accomplishes nothing. And they're preoccupied, many realists, not all, are preoccupied with great power competition. The idea that the real threats are a rising China or Russia or in India, that they look at them and try to look at them in coldly clinical terms.
Right. And
what are the ways that they can impinge upon American power or even replace us? Is China the new Wilhelmine Germany that's going to try and challenge our power? Now, the weakness of realism, I'll just say in a couple of sentences, where people will criticize it, they'll argue, if you're a liberal internationalist, they'll argue that it's somewhat antediluvian. It's a 19th century doctrine with its focus on balance of power. The things that matter today are refugee flows, climate change, energy resources, that all of these things, realists tend to have too static a conception of power. They're too focused on the military. And ultimately, it's an asphyxiating doctrine. It's not broad enough and adjusted to the modern world.
Well, first of all, I mean, some realists would say that much, if not most, of the refugee flows result from the fact that realists weren't controlling American foreign policy, right? I mean, there's been a lot of displacement of human beings due to American military intervention.
Well, when you start looking, and I think this is the point you keep making, is, Americans have tended to be pretty solipsistic about our use of power. And a realist would say that we have converted ourselves into a Sir Galahad, a knight in shining armor. And that, in fact, the fundamental precept of realism, one of them, is that the unintended consequences can be far worse than the ill that you're trying to ameliorate. For example, if we invaded full bore in Syria, at the outset, we could you create even greater chaos. Mm-hmm. And you end up, it's like stepping on a landmine to cure a headache.
Right. It's like there's a big emphasis on the perils of blowback and unintended consequences. I guess, was it Chalmers Johnson? Is that the name of the guy who wrote the Bible on blowback?
And Chalmers was an interesting guy because he started out in the CIA and was an immensely talented Asia scholar, and then was very pro-Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And then I think he became really disillusioned, and he is sort of the first advanced wave of critics of American foreign policy. Mm-hmm. He was pointing out a lot of this stuff that has become au courant today. It sounded radical when he was saying it in the 2000s, but now a lot of people talk like he does. Right.
Now, I wrote an op-ed for the New York Times now a long time ago, like more than 10 years ago, I think, called arguing that there should be a term progressive realism and a thing called progressive realism. And I said I was one. And then I wrote a piece, we should link to the Nation version. Maybe I wrote a smaller piece that I think is a better distillation. There's actually an entry in Wikipedia on progressive realism, and it kind of credits it to me, but it describes it in a way that I completely do not recognize. So I don't recommend that. But I would say, a couple of things. I think realists, they put an emphasis. Well, I think the United Nations, in its original conception, had a lot of realists in its spirit, don't you? Because there was a tremendous emphasis on the importance of, for the sake of global stability, respecting national sovereignty. Now, since then, there has become more emphasis within the UN on, there's this so-called right to protect or responsibility to protect. In other words, holding leaders responsible for what happens to their citizens within their borders. But in the original conception of the UN, the main thing was we want to stop trans-border aggression. And if you mind your own business and don't invade any other countries, it's pretty hard to run afoul of us. And obviously, you can take that, too far. Nobody would say, few people would say, don't intervene in the case of like true genocide. On the other hand, the UN Charter leaves enough room for the Security Council to decide to intervene in the case of whenever it wants, basically, if there's enough support to it. But I think even and modern realists today continue to have that emphasis on, in a certain sense, a healthy respect for national sovereignty, the idea being that once you start meddling with countries' sovereignty and deciding that you need to invade to save their people, bad things happen. And realism is sometimes called an amoral doctrine, an immoral doctrine. I think that's total bullshit. I think there's an argument that you wind up creating more death and suffering if you let liberal internationalists and neocons make the decisions, which this country has been doing for a long time now, and there's plenty of death and suffering in the Middle East to show for it, then if you show a certain respect for borders, even if you may not approve of the form of government within the borders, but you just have this idea that more trouble ensues if you meddle in people's domestic affairs in a violent way. And so that part of realism I'm fine with. The part that one of the big things progressive realism would add to it is a belief that global governance has to continue to evolve for some of the reasons you cited, environmental issues and so on, better control of weapons of mass destruction and bioweapons, whole new things that have to be controlled through international law and global governance like cyber terrorism and so on. So that's one of the places I would depart from traditional realism. But I'm going to say one more thing before I shut up. If you look at what some people would call one of the Bibles on realism, it's Morgenthau's book, Politics Among Nations.
Yeah.
He says the day may come, he says things change. And I don't know if he mentions technologies. He says the day may come when a realist could believe in world government and still be a realist. And so, I believe you can stay true to some of the principles of realism and be maybe more of a multilateralist and more of an international law obsessive than some modern realists are.
Yeah, there's no question that realism in the United States has not been a popular doctrine. I mean, George F. Kennan was a realist.
Yeah.
Probably closer to your progressive Walter Lippmann. There is a realist tradition that actually grew out for Lippmann out of World War I because people were so disillusioned with a war to end all wars.
Right.
So it's exactly what that's exactly what worries realists, is that the costs are disproportionate to what we expend. That when you create havoc when you intervene willy-nilly in other countries, which we've basically been doing for much of the Cold War.
Of course, on the other hand, another reason that realism has a bad reputation is that Henry Kissinger is considered a realist. He was very different from Kennan. He was a Cold Warrior. He was willing to drop a lot of bombs for what he perceived to be America's national interest and kill a lot of people. And so that I think that has also tainted the brand.
Definitely, because people recoiled at the perception that Kissinger was treating nations like pawns on a chessboard.
Right.
And that human life, that he was indifferent to human life. Now, he would respond no, that in fact the actions he was taking was the least bad option and so forth. But yes, realism has become tainted as this sinister European doctrine that is un-American and foreign to our freedom-loving values.
Yeah. Quick story. I used to work in the Smithsonian Castle when I worked for the Wilson Quarterly, on the mall in Washington. I would go in there one day, flash my security, and there's this old man trying to get in. They won't let him in. And he's like, because he doesn't have security to get in. And he says, I just want to go up to the Kennan Center. And he seems legit. And I said, I'll sign him in. I get into the elevator with him. And he says, they used to recognize me here. I said, oh, yeah, really? What? I'm Bob Wright. What's your name? He said, I'm George Kennan. That's my Kennan story. But so this brings us back to Trump, right? Because Trump, I mean, the part of him I liked was the realist part during the campaign.
But how do you, I mean, I'm not trying to play inquisitor here, but I'm wrestling with something here, which is, how do you deal with Trump's mendacity when it comes to all of these things? I mean, do you actually have any confidence in his foreign policy? No, we need to get rid of this guy ASAP. He is a, I mean, because for one thing, one of his major departures from realism is to totally buy the neocon line on Iran. Getting out of the Iran deal was so stupid that many of the people who were skeptical of the deal were against him getting out of the Iran deal. Massively destabilizing. And this brings us back to one issue about the Putin summit. What did they say about Syria? And we talked about this a little, and I guess we just have no way of knowing. But no, I mean, he's a nightmare. I still don't totally understand, what motivates him in any given situation. We talked about this. What's your theory about the last three big episodes here? NATO, Theresa May, and Putin. Look, I think I could be all wet here, but my surmise about the man since he started talking about foreign policy, and then if you look back at his record to the 1970s, the now famous Playboy interview, he has been fairly consistent. And it to me, he looks like the Revenant, like in the movie. I mean, he's a ghost from the past. He wants to go back to, not just domestically. Domestically, he wants to go back to 1950s America, right? Boot out the immigrants and the illegal aliens as he sees it, and restore a different America. I think he wants to restore the 1920s older Republican tradition of foreign policy. To me, Trump's version is actually more legitimate in the context of the Republican Party's traditions. It's the neocons who are the outliers. Internationalism has never been the Republican doctrine. I mean, it was for Richard M. Nixon, who fought in World War II, but
wouldn't you say Eisenhower was an internationalist?
Yes.
But I would say he was a realist. He was something of a realist internationalist. Well, I mean, when the Hungarian people rose up and said, will you help us, America? He's like, are you crazy?
I was start a war. That Eisenhower, one of the reasons he ran was that he saw, when he was a general, he saw Taft. Robert Taft was an isolationist. And he knew that Taft was going to run for the presidency, and he tried to get Taft to back down on some of his views, and Taft refused. And then Eisenhower decided he would run on the Republican ticket. If Eisenhower, see, we're all used to looking at history as though things had to happen the way they did, right? What if we're wrong? What if it was a kind of a fluke that Truman and Atchison and all of those guys were around? They had the team, and George C. Marshall. I mean, what if that was the anomaly? And then Eisenhower comes on, but you always have a restive Republican wing, right? There's always an anti-UN wing in the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. Bill Buckley, Joe McCarthy, all of these guys were kind of radical right fellows. Mm-hmm. And it reemerges after the Cold War. So maybe the Cold War was the outlier for the United States, and particularly for the Republican Party. Because if you go back and look at the fights in the Republican Party at the turn of the century, there was always, World War I. It was the irreconciliables, Henry Cabot Lodge and the others, who stopped us from entering the League of Nations. Why? Because of Article 10, which would have, in their view, subordinated the American military to a collective defense. What happens with NATO? 1949, again, there are Republican senators who are screaming about Article 5, just as Trump and his friends are screaming today about Article 5 in NATO, that it subordinates America. So I don't know. My take is that Trump in foreign policy, maybe I'm all totally wrong, maybe it's all impulse, but to me it looks like he wants to get rid of the World Trade Organization, maybe get rid of the International Monetary Fund, get rid of NATO, unshackle the United States, and be able to operate as an independent actor with Russia, China, and other countries. He wants, in other words, blow it all up. And I do not believe that if Trump is reelected, that NATO will continue to exist.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things. I'm wondering whether you are not attributing too much genuinely ideological motivation to him, although I take your point that he's been talking somewhat this way for some time. Now, John Chait, in that piece we were talking about, where he says there's a point at which Trump, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but Trump became almost the equivalent of a Russian agent. He says that the first time Trump talked about NATO in a highly skeptical way was immediately after going to Russia in late 80s in hopes of doing some deal or something. And that's a part that struck me as kind of implausible. The idea that the Russians, on their first encounter, they get some dirt on him and present it to him the next day and say, now you do what we say. I don't know what John's scenario was exactly, but I was skeptical of that. Anyway, I take your point on that. At the same time, it's so often tempting to just attribute Trump's shenanigans to the nature of personality. Like NATO was classic bully stuff, and so was Theresa May in the following sense. There's a pattern that was common to those. It was, you walk in, you push people around, and by the way, there was another literal pushing incident at the NATO thing, if you paid attention, where he pushes a guy back so he can be at the front of the picture. Kind of thing you could get a guy punched if you weren't, president of the United States. And anyway, he goes in, he does his display of dominance. Who dares challenge me? Nobody does. And then he can make nice. Now that you have acknowledged his dominance and your subservience, he'll be nice to you. This is a slight difference. He declared victory more in the case of NATO, as with Theresa May, the next day was just all kiss and make up. But I just wonder to what extent. Now, of course, first thing you say is, well, he didn't do that with Putin, and that is definitely an interesting data point. But to some, it's so often tempting to attribute things to just his being like an adolescent bully.
Well, this is the primate theory of Trump, right? James Goodall and the others saying that he comes in, thumps his chest, jumps up and down, and establishes his dominance over everyone else. I mean, there's so many theories about Trump that you start to wonder if maybe all the theories are wrong too. Maybe it's just more elemental. Maybe he just likes to troll.
Yeah.
The most basic interpretation of Trump.
Yeah.
But in some senses, his motivations actually don't matter that much, right? It's really the consequences of what he's doing.
Well, yeah, although if you want to predict his future behavior, it helps to understand his motivations, I guess, or if you want to figure out how to counter him. I think in a way, I would be interested to see what happens if some Europeans finally stood up to him. I had this fantasy. Tell me if this is crazy. He did this incredibly disrespectful thing to Theresa May. I was thinking, what if she just, before their meeting, some hours before, said, he has disrespected not just me, but the nation and the political system. He has, in effect, tried to intervene in our political system. This is completely unheard of in the annals of diplomacy. I decided this is not a propitious time to meet with him. I've canceled the meeting. Now, if she just did that, that would have been fascinating because I think her popularity in Britain would have skyrocketed. I think it would have genuinely hurt Trump at home because it's one thing to say that these snotty French don't like him or whoever else doesn't like him. But I think when people see that, man, you can't even get along with Britain, I think it would have seriously damaged him. Now, in the complete version of my fantasy, she says, now that I don't have anything to do this weekend, I have invited the heads of Germany, Canada, and France for a little talk. And they start, because they really should get together and talk about ways they can exercise collective coercion or whatever to, for example, force the U.S. to let their businesses do business with Iran, whatever. And I just am not convinced that European leaders cannot stand up to him in a way that will benefit them politically, hurt him politically, and get him to stand down.
Well, one thing that they are doing is moving much closer towards Asia. The EU just signed a trade agreement with Japan. So they are counteracting Trump. I mean, they're not sitting by idly.
But does he care about that? I mean,
hard to say. I mean, what you're saying, yes, would have been a PR embarrassment for him.
Right. That's his most.
If you do stand up to him, he does tend to back down. There's no question.
Yeah.
I wondered why she invited him in the first place. I mean, it really was a disaster for her.
Yeah, it was bad. She was humiliated, and she didn't stand up to him at all while he was there. It was the worst of both worlds.
Beat on the front lawn.
Yeah, more or less.
It wasn't on tape.
Yeah, the question you asked, like, what if Republican internationalism or even American internationalism was an aberration? The reason I think we can realistically hope not is that, one thing that's happened since the 30s and even the immediate post-war era is, the American economy is much more globalized. And, I'm not a Marxist, but I share enough of the Marxist worldview to think that powerful players influence policy. And so in principle, American capitalism should want a foreign policy that makes the world safe for global capitalism. Now, one mystery is why it hasn't been doing that, right? If it did, your magazine would be awash in money.
Yeah.
It would be like competing. These CEOs would be running to your door, showering you with money, because realism, or at least I would say a progressive realism, would actually provide the most stable platform. But in any event, the neocons wouldn't be running the show, and the liberal interventionists wouldn't. The only American companies that want that to happen is the defense contractors. So I guess I'm throwing out a theory and then casting doubt on it. I'm saying, on the one hand, global capitalism should support internationalism, but on the other hand, it seems determined to threaten internationalism in terms of the foreign policies it's tolerating.
Well, I think there was a story in the Washington Post that the Koch brothers are subsidizing a massive ad buy against the tariffs.
Now, the Koch brothers apparently their foreign policy is apparently to the liking of people like you and me, as I understand it. They are consistent with what I'm saying.
Yeah. But I think business, I don't know, maybe the businessmen were short-sighted. They liked the tax cut. Well, that's it. You bribe them with things like the tax cut, and they shut up about your foreign policy. But not permanently. I mean, I think it's sort of they look at the stock market. How can the stock market be over 25,000 right now? I
totally don't get that. But the stock market has never, to my mind, really factored in risks to global stability and even long-term economic health in the way that I would expect. It's just never reacted the way I would expect to anything.
Well, otherwise you'd be a lot richer than you are.
I would be a lot richer. So I don't know what I don't know what to say. I mean, you tell me. You're in this milieu. You need to stay funded. Your magazine does, and the center. You're what? You're put out technically by what? The Center for the National Interest or something?
Correct. We have both a website, daily website, and then the magazine, which comes out every 2 months. Let me see if I have here's our latest issue, actually. It's right here, which I'm flogging.
Oh, cool. Wait, what does it say on it?
It says a Trump foreign policy.
Okay. Are they approving or disapproving?
Both.
50-50?
One is asking if it could be a success, and the other is saying that Trump has got it all wrong. But both the authors are realists.
Yeah. What do you think, before we go on the question of like the extent to which we need NATO?
By the way, you should have gleaned that that's the old New Republic trick to publish contrasting articles, remember?
Yes, I remember that. It's also a trick when you kind of don't have a single piece that's quite cover-worthy, not to cast aspersions on those two no doubt wonderful articles, but you know, it's like, oh man, I remember that. Like midweek, it's like, what do we have for the cover? It's like, well, aren't these two pieces kind of related? Oh, and this third one is kind of like that. But I remember once we had two pieces both by Harvard professors and both about economics or something. They both made some recommendations, so we called it the Harvard Economic Workout or something, and had a picture of some guy working out or something.
In some ways, I actually think you were the most liberal editor of the New Republic during the Peretz regime.
Well, you mean on foreign policy in particular?
Yeah.
Well, Mike Kinsley, it's not so much that he wasn't liberal as that he didn't care as much about foreign policy as I did.
Yeah.
But there have certainly been some converts. Peter Beinart, while editor of the New Republic, wasn't so liberal, but he's fine. He's seen the light since then.
He's become an apostate.
Yeah, not him alone. Andrew Sullivan has moved. It's not nearly as consistent, but certainly on the issue of Israel, which was very important to Marty. Of course, Andrew has
very important.
What?
Very important. It was central. It was the core of his identity.
Would you go that far?
Yeah. Passionate.
Yeah, I might go that far. But anyway, this is all neither here nor there. Is there anything else we should say before we...
Yeah, I think you're sort of dodging around this question of
Again, customarily, I ask the questions, but go ahead.
Well, you know, we probably know each other too well. Maybe that's part of the problem. I'm not sufficiently deferential to you. Maybe that's
that's a common problem in the world. Believe me, within the walls of this very house.
I believe that from my own experience. What I was going to say is, you know, I'm still wrestling with. I think the question that John Chait and say Josh Marshall at Talking Points memo, Blake Hounshell of Politico today said that he had written a piece called Why I'm a Skeptic About the Trump-Russia Collusion. Today he said, I'm going to have to start revising my views. Mm-hmm. I guess if you didn't see the press conference, but I have to say, I did find it rather extraordinary, the extent to which Trump and Putin seem to be lobbing, tennis balls at each other.
Yeah.
And it looked like a playful encounter. This wasn't the president meeting with an adversary. He was more chummy with Putin than he is with any other leader that I've seen. So I wonder, do you think that the Russians have, and have compromising financial information? I mean, it really does appear in some way that
it's odd because again, there are competing theories. There's Trump really admires an authoritarian strongman. Putin is the guy Trump would like to be.
Yeah.
He's totally feared, right? Yeah. There's that. There's, as we said before, there's a lot of cases where near the end of a meeting, he's really making nice with whoever he's sitting next to. There's that. Now, on the other hand, it just seems like it would have been so easy for him to take a path without really antagonizing Putin that would have played better domestically, right? Like on the question of whether Russia did it, there's a lot he could have said without directly saying to Putin, yes, I think Russia did it. That would have been better than what he said. Now there, we can just say, look, the guy's not very smart, which is a heartfelt belief of mine.
Or was it in fact, I'm going to throw out something that's lurking in the back of my mind. Did Trump in fact do this deliberately and with a good measure of cunning to consolidate his power? He wants to show that he can successfully crush this allegation, not by disproving it, but by consolidating his hold on the Republican Party and showing that he does not have to relent on this issue, that he can in fact dispose of it on his own terms, thereby taking what looks like a weakness and turning it into a strength.
So you mean like if after this summit his poll numbers don't drop and maybe even edge up slightly, he will have sent the message to the Republican hawks, nice try?
Good luck. And yes. And in fact, he will continue, he will ramp up the allegations. He will, against Mueller and others, he will, if the Republicans manage to hold on to the House, he will fire Mueller the first week after the November election. He's going to convert what looks like a weakness into a strength. That is what I'm wondering. Now, maybe this is giving Trump too much credit, but he does strike me as shrewd and has a feral cunning. And, you know, take a weakness and turn it into a strength.
Well, he certainly believes that often doing something that's going to be pretty popular in America ultimately helps him, partly because it is going to so antagonize the resistance that their reaction will help define the reaction of his base. But that could be. I will say that I have a different set of reasons than Blake for, I mean, I didn't see the press conference, for being more suspicious now than I used to be that there was active collusion. And it's actually this. It's that, you know, did you see this thing? You know who Marcy Wheeler is? Empty Wheel?
Yeah.
And you saw this thing recently where she's a very respected national security reporter, and she's been on Blogging Heads a few times. And you saw this thing recently where she came out and said, you know, I should tell you, I'm a reporter, but I actually had to bring some evidence to the attention of the FBI because I became convinced that one of my sources was actually basically working for Russia.
Uh-huh.
And in the course of that and maybe subsequent pieces, she conveyed that she thought there was evidence in the hands of Mueller that Trump himself was implicated in something. Now, I want to juxtapose that and supplement it with a conversation I had with her on Blogging Heads in January, which now I see in a new light, in light of what she just said. In that conversation, she kind of said, she put a finer point on the nature of the collusion than she did in a recent writing. She said, I have reason to believe that Mueller has evidence that there was a quid pro quo involving the emails. Now, at that point, she didn't say Trump personally. At that point, she just said people in the campaign said, if you will help us with those emails you're hacking, we will. And she implied that it was two things: sanctions relief and some kind of deal on Syria. Russia wanted sanctions relief, some kind of deal on Syria. So you look at, and I said, can you tell me what your basis for this is? And she said, well, some of it's on the record, and she cited it. And I said, well, what else? Is it your reporting or what? And she said, well, I can't, and she got it. So I think it's pretty certain that it's likely that this source of hers that she has now lately started to talk about, who she went to the FBI about, gave her reason to believe, or at least the set of inquiries that this source was part of, gave her reason to believe there was an actual quid pro quo involving the email and specific policies that Russia wanted. And if you put that together with the recent writings where she fingers Trump, the intimation is that Trump himself may have signed off on that deal and that Mueller may have evidence of that. Now, that would be significant, right?
Yeah.
I think even given the way Trump has prepared the landscape for survival, I think he would probably be impeached and even convicted.
Mm-hmm.
If that's the case. Maybe I'm naive. And it may not be the case, but I think it could well be.
Wow.
We will link to the little tweet I did about that got no attention as a way to steering people to both I have the little 2-minute segment of the video. I'll send you the tweet afterwards. The 2-minute segment of the video in conjunction with the stuff Marcy wrote.
Yeah. Well, one thing is, I think we will find out by September. My gut.
I hope so. There is that idea floating around that Mueller's going to drop something significant before.
They just arrested someone else today, a Russian national. So it does look like it's heating up.
Oh, did he?
The Department of Justice did.
I didn't know that. You said they arrested somebody, or?
Yeah.
They arrested somebody who was already indicted by Mueller?
No.
New indictment and arrest.
It's a Russian national. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, Jacob, thank you. Everyone should read The National Interest. It's such a breath of fresh air compared to everything else about foreign policy. It is not quite everything. There's this other magazine, but certainly compared to the, a lot of what happens in that realm of discourse. I will say you're actually pretty eclectic, sometimes more eclectic than I would like to see, but in terms of your giving voice to people that I disapprove of. But hey, on the website especially, probably. But
I believe in controversy and combat, intellectual combat.
Yeah, many editors do. I was once one of these people.
Thank you, Bob.
And I don't begrudge you the experience or the gratification. All right. So thanks so much, Jacob. We'll what's your Twitter handle? Tell people.
It's at Jacob Heilbrunn.
Easy enough. We'll link to it from the site, and everyone should check out the magazine. Thanks a lot, Jacob.
Thanks, Bob.